At this point, I will hand over to Gabrielle to start the proceedings.
Hi, everybody. Welcome, and welcome to those who are still joining. You probably can't hear me anyway, but I'm Gabrielle Bammer. I'm the president of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity, and it's my great pleasure to make a few opening remarks before handing over to Jason and Michael. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Jason.
Yes.
So I would like to start with an acknowledgement. We're still developing an acknowledgement for the ITD Alliance Oceania Regional Network, but here's the one this is what we're working with at the moment, to really honour the contributions and rights of Indigenous people, especially recognising the importance of Indigenous knowledge, culture and traditional practices, and their contribution to sustainable and equitable development and the proper management of the environment. We celebrate the diversity and richness of cultures and recognise historic injustices resulting from colonisation and dispossession. Given that we're on, next slide please, Jason. Given that we're on Australian country, many of us, so Jason and Michael in particular, who will be doing the main presentation, I'd also like to do a more traditional Australian acknowledgement of country, which is to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose lands the University of Technology Sydney campus stands. And I'd also like to pay respects to elders both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. I'd like to further acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various ancestral lands from which other attendees are joining us today. So I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra, and to pay respects to elders past and present. So Jason's going to do the housekeeping, but I will tell you now that this is being recorded, and if you're not comfortable being on the recording, please act appropriately. Remove your name from your little Duvalaki bio thingy, and stay with the camera off. And Jason, you'll probably have to say that again for the people who are still coming in. I really want to acknowledge the work that Jason has done pulling this together, and the work of the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology Sydney, who is hosting Michael's visit to Australia, which is really very important, and Jason and others who I know Jason will acknowledge have been very instrumental in making today's seminar happen, and it's really exciting to have the first seminar of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity Oceania Regional Network. This network's been pulled together partly by the Global Alliance and partly by Nitro Oceania. And I don't think Beth Fulton, who's the president of Nitro Oceania, is in the room yet, but I want to acknowledge her as the other key person who's been behind the scenes in making this happen. So let me move on to introducing Jason as chair. So Jason is a professor of planning, health and environment at the University of Technology in Sydney, at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. He leads the graduate Inter and Transdisciplinarity research program, and that includes 68 PhD students, and he's also a research director at that institute. I'm delighted to say that he's just been re-elected to the leadership board of the Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity, and that he's also on the organising committee of the ITD Alliance Regional Network. There are many others on the call who've also been instrumental in putting this first seminar together, and I'm going to leave it to Jason to acknowledge them, which I know he's going to do. So thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So I'd just like to start by outlining the agenda for today. So first of all, to thank Gabrielle for her welcome to this event. And then I'd also, we're also in the part two, after I give a little bit of housekeeping and some guidelines, and also thank the broader team who's been involved in putting this together. We will then have the inaugural Global ITD Alliance Oceania Regional Network seminar, the first one by Michael O'Rourke. And then after that, we will have that will be question and answers, and the presentation itself will take approximately about 45 minutes or 50 minutes. And then we'll move to the Talanoa after that, which is the opportunity for people across Oceania to actually engage with each other and talk with each other and introduce each other. Oceania is an incredibly diverse and broad part of the world, and with many different cultures and many different opportunities, and to actually explore and understand what ITD might mean. So at this point, I would just like to first start by acknowledging the event support team. So the first I'd like to thank Pael Maharaj. Pael is from Fiji and is a PhD candidate from the University of Queensland, and is also on the Oceania Regional Network Organising Committee. And I would also like to acknowledge Karen Anderson. So Karen is the Interim Executive Secretary for the ITD Alliance. She is from Boston in the US, but has previously lived and worked in Australia. Her background is transdisciplinarity from a library and information science perspective. So I'd just like to thank both Pael and Karen for their support and incredible support during this event and in the preparation for this event. And the smoothness and running of this event is down to their support in many ways. So at this point, I'd just like to run through some guidelines for the seminar presentation. We'll talk about the guidelines for the Talanoa a little later. So at this point, I'd just like to say, please, we'd really love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Where are you from? What are your expertise and your name, and any other types of greetings you feel appropriate from your location. And please also use the chat to raise technical and procedural questions. If something is happening we don't know about, unless you're going to be able to tell us. So, and also please, by all means, share information. The other thing I would like to say is, please turn your microphones off during the presentation, but we'd really encourage you, if you are okay with being recorded, to leave your video on throughout the whole process of today, just because one of the key opportunities today is for everyone to get to know each other and see each other. And just that, I would just reiterate this point for people who might have come online in the last couple of minutes. This event is being recorded, and if you don't wish to be recorded, please turn your mic off and your video so you're not recorded. We'd still enjoy your participation in whatever capacity you feel is appropriate. During the Talanoa, which is the second half, we won't be recording it, and that will be a completely open discussion at that point. So at this point, I would now like to, introduce Michael O'Rourke and the presentation. So it is with great pleasure that I actually get to introduce Michael O'Rourke. Michael is Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University in the US, where he is also faculty in Ag Bio Research and Environmental Science and Policy. Executive Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center, a research and practice group that focuses on philosophical approaches to facilitating cross-disciplinary research, and former director of the MSU, that is the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity. His primary research interests are interdisciplinary theory, epistemology, communication, and epistemic integration in collaboration, cross-disciplinary research. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Michael. So I'll stop sharing and Michael will bring up his slides.
All right. Can everyone see those? I hope. Good. All right. Thank you, Jason, very much for the kind introduction. I am Michael O'Rourke, and I am pleased to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon talking about cross-disciplinary integration, its nature and practice. As Jason mentioned, I work at Michigan State University, and so I would like to begin my seminar with MSU land acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. All right, so this is the agenda for the seminar. I'll begin with a few preliminaries, and then I'll talk about what I'm doing, or at least what I take myself to be doing. A couple of research questions, and I'll describe a philosophy of cross-disciplinary integration. Then I'll talk a bit about the problem that I'm addressing in the seminar, and I'll close with remarks related to the response that I'm developing with colleagues associated with the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. And then I'll just have a slide concluding things at the end. Jason introduced me, so I don't need to introduce myself again. One thing that I can say is that he read a list of areas that I conduct research in, and you can think of the bulk of my research effort really is focused on team science or collaborative. Actually, science is probably a little bit of a misnomer. It's a collaborative research. So what I'm interested in communication and integration and so forth, primarily with a view to understanding how we collaborate when we conduct research together. The work that I'll talk about today has been supported in part by a U.S. National Science Foundation award made by the Science and Technology Studies program, under the title, A Theory of Integration and Cross-Disciplinary Research and Practice. I'd like to thank the Oceania Regional Network really from the bottom of my heart for the opportunity to spend some time with you and to give this seminar. It's not lost on me that this is the first one, so that is quite an honor, and I'm deeply grateful. The Oceania Regional Network is a part of the ITD Alliance, Global Alliance for Inter and Transdisciplinarity. And I'd like to just highlight a couple of things from the ITD Alliance website. The ITD Alliance has as its purpose to strengthen and promote global capacity and caliber of collaborative modes of boundary crossing research and practice. And the boundary crossing research, boundary spanning research that is supported by the ITD Alliance is focused on advancing capacity for collaborative research, interrelating or integrating diverse perspectives, and fostering innovation, among other things. So the ITD Alliance was created and exists to help those of us who are interested in this mode of research practice be more efficient and effective in pursuing it. Right? And one of the key aspects of this, installed in the mission statement for the organization, is this idea of interrelating or integrating diverse perspectives. If you've been around this block a few times, no doubt you've heard people talk about integration, or talked about integration yourself. And so I just kind of want to highlight the fact that it shows up in a very prominent place on the ITD Alliance website. And this is what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about integration understood as an aspect of the kind of work that the Oceania Regional Network and ITD Alliance more broadly are interested in fostering. The research questions behind my project are two. First of all, when we talk about integrating diverse perspectives in collaborative research and practice, what do we mean by integrate? Right? What does this term mean? That's a semantic research question. I was trained as a philosopher of language, so I kind of at least do semantics for a living. So semantic research questions are near and dear to me, and this is one that I think is important for us to be addressing as a community. The second research question is, how can an understanding of the meaning of integrate help us advance cross-disciplinary research and practice? So how would an answer to the first research question help us do what we are setting out to do better? I'm using cross-disciplinary, by the way, as a generic cover term for boundary crossing and boundary spanning work, so interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. When it's important to be more precise, I'll use different terms. But if I use cross-disciplinarity, I mean to be talking in general about the boundary crossing work. My remarks today are focused primarily on the first of these research questions. As I suggested, I take the two research questions to be related. That it's important to have an appreciation for the semantics of these terms, for what they mean, if we're going to be pursuing the implementation, I guess you could say, of these concepts in our practice. So I'll talk about the semantic research question in the time that remains. So I'm a philosopher, Jason mentioned that, and I take myself to be pursuing a philosophical project in responding to this research question. So I am attempting to develop what you might call a philosophy of cross-disciplinary integration. This slide is intended to provide a kind of map of research interest in integration, and it should help you sort of locate the project that I'm describing in this talk. So we can begin, and I should say this is focused on science. Science is kind of an example really of the level structure that I'm describing here. This applies to integrative research, across the map of knowledge. But just to kind of maybe localize and render the conversation a little bit more precise, I put it in terms of science. At level one, you have investigators who pursue, at least with respect to some research questions, if they're interested in cross-disciplinary research, integrative science. So they use integrative techniques and practices in pursuit of scientific outcomes. So these are scientists pursuing cross-disciplinary research outcomes. Above the integrative scientists, you have investigators who are interested in producing models of the scientific practice that occurs at level one. And these models might mention or will almost certainly rely on integration. If the models of the work that's being done at level one foregrounds the integrative aspects, then that integration as a concept will be explicitly mentioned. So at level two, you find, for example, philosophers of science who are interested in understanding from a conceptual perspective the integrative science that's taking place at level one. One more level up, you have what we can call philosophy of integration. So philosophers of integration are interested in looking at not only what philosophers of science do, but also what integrative scientists do when they either invoke or model integration. So philosophers of integration will produce models of integration that generalize over models of scientific practice, so the things produced at level two, or and over integrative science itself, so the kind of activity pursued at level one. So this is a little bit rough and ready, I admit, but this is intended to kind of highlight the fact that you can do philosophy and integration in a way that really kind of resides at 2 clicks above the integrative scientific practice that I think many of us engage in when we pursue cross-disciplinarity. As a philosopher, I was trained in the analytic tradition, which means that the primary methodology of the work that I utilize is conceptual analysis. So those who use this particular method think of concepts as classificatory devices. So devices used to classify our experience into categories. A philosophical take on an issue like cross-disciplinary integration will involve identifying conditions, satisfaction of which qualifies something as an instance or not of a given concept. Now, traditionally, conceptual analysis is focused on producing analyses that involve individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. But there's all sorts of reasons to believe that the kinds of thick concepts that really are of interest to us, and I think cross-disciplinary integration is a good example, defy analysis in terms of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. This is, kind of made famous as a critique of conceptual analysis by Ludwig Wittgenstein. My interest is not in pursuing a traditional target, individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. Rather, I'm interested in looking at sufficient conditions of cross-disciplinary integration. So examples of cross-disciplinary integration, and then analyzing them, hoping to identify patterns that enable us to understand this phenomenon across contexts. One goal that you might have as a philosopher was articulated by Maureen O'Malley in this quote. It's important to identify what is meant by integration and whether different interpretations can be combined coherently into a general use of the concept. So the idea that you might be pursuing as a philosopher, especially in connection with research question 1, is that that there's something like a general use of the concept of integration that is made across contexts. And what is that? What is that general use? Pursuing a goal like that will involve performing tasks, and there are a number of philosophical tasks that have been identified by philosophers in the literature. A couple of these lists, one includes understanding what integration involves, how integrative practices operate, how integrative accounts are formed, and what challenges and limits to integration are. This is from Ingo Brigant. And these I take to be tasks you perform if you are pursuing research question number 1 or something like it, right? Because answering questions like these should put you in a position to better understand what the meaning of integrate is, and how that term gets used to talk about what we do when we engage in cross-disciplinarity. Another and different specification of a philosophical task is due to Alan Love and Gary Lugar. A philosophical task of generating epistemic models of integration that account for scientific practices and assist ongoing empirical inquiry. These, Love and Lugar are both philosophers of science. This is a specification of a task that's associated with research question 2, right? So what can we do as philosophers interested in the meaning of the term integrate that actually helps scientists or helps researchers conduct this type of research? So because I'm interested in this talk in research question 1, my remarks are going to be more directly related to the tasks specified by Brigant and also associated with the goal as articulated by O'Malley. Okay, so starting point. We all have to have starting points in our project. They got to begin somewhere. And I am taking as my starting point for today to be a quote from Julie Thompson Klein. So this represents a prominent take on the role of cross-disciplinary integration in the activities pursued by members of the Oceania Regional Network, for instance. Julie wrote in 2012, integration is widely regarded as the primary methodology of interdisciplinarity. I think this is consistent with the kind of prominence enjoyed by integration in the ITD Alliance mission statement, for example. There are a number of others, very prominent statements that have been published that also foreground integration as a key part of this type of work. It also finds resonance with comments by and positions of many other prominent contributors to the literature. So I take this to be a almost received view of where integration fits in the kind of practice that we engage in. I want to analyze the quote just briefly before diving into a more sustained discussion of integration. When I first read this, I was a little bit sort of confused by why she would call integration a methodology. So at first I struggled a little bit to understand that. I think it helped me to understand what she was saying, first of all, by distinguishing methodology from methods. When I'm being strict and precise, I try to do this, although sometimes I just use these terms interchangeably, which is a mistake. But for the purposes of this slide, I'm going to try to be careful. So you think of methodology as an abstract account of why methods work. So a methodology would be an abstract account of why a particular class of methods work when they do. Right. So if you think of methodology in that way, then you can think of methodology as utilized by Julie in that quote to provide an abstract account of what distinguishes successful from unsuccessful interdisciplinarity. So what I take her to be saying is that if you want to do interdisciplinary work, you need to do integrative work, right? So integration, being a primary methodology, highlights how you need to orient yourself to your interdisciplinary projects if you hope to be successful. To call it primary is to say that it's the go-to way of doing interdisciplinary work. It's the dominant way of thinking about how interdisciplinary work is done. Again, based on my reading of the literature, I think this is a totally legitimate take on integration. It shows up broadly across the literature and many different locations as a way of describing what you're hoping to accomplish if you approach a topic in an interdisciplinary way. Another interesting aspect of this is that if you call it the primary methodology, that at least to my ears suggests that there are additional methodologies, maybe secondary or tertiary methodologies that are not integrative. And that I think also turns out to be true. And I'll acknowledge this in the penultimate slide of my talk today, but I won't spend much time addressing it. I'm going to focus most of my attention on integration. But it's worth acknowledging that to call it a primary methodology suggests that there are others out there that might be competitors for how we think about interdisciplinary research and practice. Okay, so my starting point then is that quote. And I think the quote should motivate us to be interested in what integration is, right? If it is in fact the primary methodology of interdisciplinarity, then it would be incumbent upon us as interdisciplinarians or cross-disciplinarians more generally to know what this methodology is, to be accomplished and skillful practitioners of that particular methodology. I think that requires that we understand what the term means first. Now, once you start digging into the semantics of integration, at least cross-disciplinary integration, you confront pretty quickly, I think, a semantic dilemma. On the one hand, because of its wide distribution across many literatures, it's not unreasonable to think that the term integration is being used to signal more or less the same thing, putting together or combination in all of these locations, right? So that suggests that there might be a uniform meaning, something akin to O'Malley's general use of the concept that at least resonates with those of us who engage in this practice, because we use this term all the time to talk about what we do. Emphasis from this perspective, right, the single meaning from the top down, is on what's in common context to context when we're talking about cross-disciplinarity. But it's not, I want to highlight universally received view that there is a single meaning from the top down, right? There are many who argue, including many prominent contributors to interdisciplinary theory, that there is no general meaning. Klein, for example, denies that there's a universal formula, and Brigant denies that there's a monolithic account of integration. At best, you might think that integration as it's used across these many contexts is something like a family resemblance concept, also this idea also due to Wittgenstein that you know that they resemble each other, kind of way family members resemble each other, but there isn't any particular necessary condition that they all satisfy, and the sufficient conditions exhibited by all these instances are widely various. Here, if you adopt this sort of view that integration is actually polysemous, right, has many meanings across contexts, what you're emphasizing is what's different across those contexts. Now, my philosophical style, I guess, a value of mine is when confronted by dilemmas like this, to try to like go down the middle and split the difference if possible. And I think that can be done in this case. And I think it could be done to great effect, in fact, in this case. Identifying a top-down schema that can be specified differently context to context, right? So the schema would be articulated in terms of high-level constraints that limit how integration must be understood in context. And so capture what's in common across contexts. So the schematic specification, the constraints that you might associate with integration, those are what anchor our belief that there's something in common across these many contexts. But a schema by itself, a set of constraints by itself, is not an analysis of an instance of integration. In order to get from the schematic level down to a point where you're building an actual explanation of a specific instance, you need to specify what those constraints in context. And it could very well be that specifying those constraints in this, in say public health, might be dramatically different than specifying the same set of constraints in, say, water ecology, right? You might get explicit explanations of cross-disciplinary integration in these different contexts that look dramatically different. And that possibility captures the sort of many meanings from the bottom up idea that is a part of the semantic dilemma. The model that I've had a hand in developing and that I'm continuing to work on, that I believe splits the difference and helps us deal with the semantic dilemma and answer research question number one, is what we call the IPO model, where IPO stands for Input Process Output Model. And we published this initially in 2016. The idea behind the approach is that integration is best understood as a process that involves inducing a certain type of change to inputs in the production of outputs. Right? So inputs moving through some sort of processing, and then outputs come out the other side, right? This way of thinking about integration, cross-disciplinary integration, represents a common process product ambiguity that the notion of integration exhibits, right? So when you talk about integration in talking about cross-disciplinarity, sometimes it's not clear whether the person's describing the process, right? What has to happen in order for integration to be successful, or the product, right? The actual outputs that mark success in a particular instance. And that ambiguity, that process product ambiguity, is captured and I think reflected quite nicely with the IPO model. So that's another sort of at least reason to be hopeful about its legitimacy as a way of thinking about this topic. Here's a figure that we published in that 2016 paper that gives you a sense of what we're thinking about in a little bit more detail, right? So you have boxes for inputs, process, and outputs. And at the bottom, you have parameters, variables that specified in context that apply across the process, across the arc of the IPO model. And I'll talk about these briefly. Inputs and outputs, for that matter, are described in terms of their quality and their quantity. The distinction that we discussed under the banner of quality in talking about inputs and outputs is the distinction between abstract elements and concrete elements. We installed that in the figure because that's what we were able to extract as an important distinction among inputs in the literature review that was a part of that paper. It's not that we think the abstract concrete distinction is the be all and end all of what it is to be an input into an integration process. That's not it, right? It just that stood out to us as an important consideration that people have discussed. Quantity, though, I think is probably more kind of central. Like, how many inputs are we talking about, and what's the difference between them? The process box also is kind of distinguished in terms of quality and quantity. Under quality, we talked about integrative relations, so the relations that inputs are put into in the production of the outputs. You'll notice that integrative relations in that notion, that term, actually involves the concept of integration. So this highlights the fact that we're not really explaining integration with this model. We're kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit by talking about integrative relations in our model of integration. And I'll address that point here in a few minutes. Other things that emerged for us in thinking about process had to do with whether it was purposive or algorithmic. Those also were points of emphasis in the literature. Quantity, when it comes to processing, includes numbers of changes and degree of change. Outputs, again, abstract versus concrete, and the number of outputs. Here, difference also mattered, but in this case, it was difference of the outputs relative to the inputs. This was another thing, that how different are the outputs from the inputs in an integration process. The parameters that we identified this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but these are, again, were the ones that stood out for us from the literature that we reviewed. One has to do with the commensurability of the inputs as the inputs are fed into the process, the integrative process. How different are they? How much conflict is there between the inputs that are being integrated? What's the scale of this? Is it global? Are we talking about, for instance, the integration of disciplines in the production of a new discipline, which would be a very high level kind of global type of integration? Or are we talking about maybe integrating a column of data with a row of data in a spreadsheet, right? That would be a very local example of what could be cross-disciplinary integration. And then comprehensiveness is a parameter that concerns the extent to which the inputs are recoverable from the outputs, right? If the integration exhibits high comprehensiveness, that would mean that you lose the inputs in the production of the outputs. You can't recover them from the outputs. Whereas low comprehensiveness would signal that you could still be able to identify and retrieve, in effect, the inputs from the output that you generated through the process. Now, there are a number of limitations with the model. It was intended to be a kind of what we hoped would be a provocative suggestion about what cross-disciplinary integration was, right? It was intended to provide a set of high-level constraints, but it was really more a proposal in a polished explanatory account. The quality-quantity distinction that we helped ourselves to in distinguishing aspects of inputs, outputs, and process. I can't really say that. I mean, that was available to us as a kind of philosophically motivated way of thinking about some of those differences. But again, is it the best way to think about those differences? I can't say for sure if that's true. So that this holds for inputs, outputs. It also holds for process. I'm pretty confident that the final analysis of if you develop this model and continue to develop it, that integrative relations will remain central in the story. But most of the other elements in that initial specification, I don't have the same confidence about. So it strikes me that if you're inclined to think that there's something to this approach to cross-disciplinary integration, there's work to do, right? We need to develop the model, develop the sets of constraints so that it becomes easier for us to understand how you can take them and instantiate them in particular contexts. Now, what I'm going to do for the time that remains is talk about some new developments. These are developments that I've been working on in a partnership with a group of researchers associated with the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, a microintegration group primarily. what we've done is we've attempted to address the semantic dilemma by focusing on a cluster of papers, a special section of a journal from 2013. It was edited by Brigant. This is a way of getting around a problem that the semantic dilemma highlights. Namely, if for instance, the many meanings from bottom-up way of thinking about cross-disciplinary integration is true, then it would be a mistake to draw examples from across the disciplinary spectrum, because that would probably guarantee that you're aggregating ways of thinking about integration that should not be aggregated. So at least as a proof of concept, what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of choose some examples that exhibited a high degree of variability in thinking about integration, but where we could be fairly confident that when they used the term, they were talking about the same thing. And so this special section is focused on integration in the life sciences. And that's why the semantic dilemma is really motivating us to be careful about the data that we use in this initial research. Okay, so one thing that we've done is we've pushed forward, I think, analysis of the inputs and the outputs with this work. We think from the literature review, that from analyzing these examples, that it's helpful to understand both inputs and outputs in terms of their structure and their content. Because we're talking about cross-disciplinary integration, often what we're talking about are sort of epistemic inputs related to knowledge, to research. We identify the structure of an input and an output in terms of its format. It's specifically its epistemic format. So is it an explanation? Is it a method? Is it data? Is it some higher level thing like a field or a discipline? Formats have contents. So inputs and outputs have contents, right? The topics that they're about. It's also important in this context to think about where they come from, right? This is cross-disciplinary integration. So whatever you're trying to integrate, say explanations, it's in order for it to be cross-disciplinary, you need to have integration or explanations from different disciplines, right? So that's the domain from which these inputs and outputs derive. So if you look at these, like 1 and 2, an input might be analyzed in terms of a format represented by E, coming from some domain or other C, and it's about topic T. More, robustly in terms of actual examples, you might think of the format to be explanations about carcinogenesis, that's the topic, from cell biology, molecular genetics, and epidemiology, right? So, this is kind of when people talk in these papers, and this is true, I would submit across a wide swath of this literature about what's getting integrated or what's being produced by cross-disciplinary integration. They talk like this. We're talking about formats, topics, and domains. This sets us up to think in a sort of formulaic way about what integration, cross-disciplinary integration might look like. This formula could be read as follows: the integration of n inputs, each consisting of a format related to a topic and belonging to a domain, yields k outputs, right, where each output consists of a format, a topic, and a domain. And the key difference that kind of marks this is an integrative process is that there are fewer outputs than there are inputs, right? So the process and this way of thinking about it you'd represent integration as a relation from an input tuple to an output tuple, where the cardinality of the output tuple is lower than that of the input tuple. Here's an example from one of the papers by James Griesemer. Griesemer in his paper talks about the work of David Wake. In this particular example, this quote focuses on a paper of theirs where they integrate descriptive anatomy with biomechanics of the plethodontid feeding system. The paper integrates approaches from two specialties, anatomy and biomechanics, where anatomical description and mechanical modeling and its use of the descriptive data to inform the model of the feeding system. So Griesemer likes to talk about approaches being integrated, And so you find that that's the format. So the approach in one case is from anatomy about this salamander's feeding system. And the other approach from biomechanics is also about the same feeding system. And together, when you integrate them, you actually generate an explanatory model of this feeding system that's a contribution to evolutionary morphology. Now, you might wonder why the complexity, how does the complexity help us? And that, I think, is a legitimate concern. One of the main things that I think we get from this, I think there's more to potential to this than just this, but one value of having a formula like this is it gives us a normal form for representing integrative instances, right? If you make an integrative claim, a claim about cross-disciplinary integration, you can represent it in this way, and that supports comparison across contexts, comparison of integration instance to instance. Another thing that is important to highlight in thinking about and work that we've done in thinking about integrative process is to think a little bit harder about how integrative relations figure into integrative processes. I think we found ourselves in that paper, and I think you see this in the literature. The people who are inclined to focus on relations slip back and forth between talking about processes and talking about relations. And there's a reason for that. Process and relation are so closely aligned, primarily because you can interdefine them. So processes can be understood as dynamic changes to the relational structure of a system, and relations can be understood as static snapshots that obtain due to process-based changes in a system. So in other words, more simply, processes can be understood as changes in relations among elements of a system, and relations can be understood as snapshots of an unfolding process at different times. This gives you a kind of moving picture view of change, a moving picture view of the process, right? Where the relations are static by themselves, but when you put them together, you get a dynamic understanding of how integration takes place. Further work on integrative relations highlights extrinsically how integrative relations are distinct from disintegrative relations and preservative relations. So integrative relations exhibit decreasing cardinality, disintegrative relations exhibit increasing cardinality, and preservative relations exhibit equal cardinality between inputs and outputs. Intrinsically, we are developing a proposal inspired by the work of Karen Bennett, a metaphysician in the US, who has developed an account of what she calls building relations, which are relations invoked to answer questions about what gives rise to or makes up or generates another. Bennett, so this is an attempt to say more about integrative relations that hopefully doesn't just kick the can down the road and kind of in a circular way use the very concept that we're trying to analyze. For her, building relations exhibit three characteristics. They're asymmetric or directed. They're necessitating, in the idea being that necessarily if the inputs obtain, the output does too. That's to rule out indeterministic building, where whatever gets built just pops up out of nothing. And then there's generativity, a condition that she introduces because directedness and necessitation are very formal. You can have those characteristics obtained between things that really don't seem to be building one another, whereas generativity requires that in order for a relation to qualify as a building relation, that the builders generate the build. Like whatever examples you're looking at support claims of generation between the inputs and the output. Additional characteristics we submit are needed to get from this general account of building relations to integrative relations. Decreasing cardinality I've already mentioned. I think also it's important to go beyond generativity and demand that the relationship between inputs and outputs exhibit even stronger connection. So the idea of counterfactual dependence is that the nature of the outputs counterfactually depends on the nature of the input. So if you change the inputs, if you were to change the inputs, you get different outputs, right? That seems to be an aspect that's exhibited by integrative, cross-disciplinary and integrative processes across many examples. All right, so these are the new developments I hope to describe, and I'm just going to close here by acknowledging that not all ITD researchers privilege integration. Other methodologies center questioning certain kinds of questions, overcoming incommensurability or a differend, like having to come up with an entirely new language. That might be what marks meaningful cross-disciplinarity. So in these cases, you have other methodologies that are preferred over integration to making sense out of interdisciplinarity. Still others, like Dr. Bammer, narrow down what integration applies to. In her 2013 work, she distinguishes integration from synthesis, for example. So that's another way to kind of think about integration that might sort of change its location conceptually in this in interdisciplinarity, and might have implications for how we answer the two research questions that I mentioned at the top. My last slide, I think it's I don't want to summarize what I said. I basically what I want to end with is a call to the community. I think there's a whole lot of work to do on this topic. I know I've spent the whole time talking about semantics. I think it's important, again, to understand the meaning of the terms that we use if we're going to use these terms to help improve our practice. And we've been commenting as a community for decades, like going back to the 70s at least, if not earlier, how integration in particular is poorly understood. And I think that for all the time that's passed, I think we still poorly understand this. And in my opinion, it's partly responsible for fragmentation of our efforts. The lack of a received methodology, a received way of thinking about what it is we're doing, discourages people from looking around and using ideas that others have suggested, and encourages people to reinvent the wheel. I think of this as honestly as a kind of an embarrassment for us, right? We're doing important work, but it's hard for this important work to be taken maybe as seriously as we'd like it to be if our primary methodology remains something that we're still, I think, somewhat clueless about. Not to be too provocative, but with that, I'm going to stop talking. And I thank you very much for your time.